I absolutely loathe the invasive headlines and found that sort of relentless exposure deeply unsettling. Yet I was determined to curate my image, revealing only the most flawless version of myself to the world. I claimed I just wanted an ordinary existence like anyone else, but let's be real, Brigitte Bardot was always destined to be far more than just another silver screen icon. She single-handedly rewrote the rulebook on womanhood, embodying a fierce spirit of rebellion and absolute liberty that defined an entire era. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, she stood as the ultimate international emblem of emancipation, shockingly turning her back on the glitz of Hollywood right at the height of her powers to live by her own rules, and later channeling that same fiery passion into a lifelong crusade for animal welfare. Put simply, Bardot lived her truth with a reckless boldness, never once offering an excuse for who she was. Yet lurking beneath that carefully polished exterior was a shadow, a chapter of her personal history that remained messy, painful, and largely unspoken. And as the years rolled on, and her legacy cemented the heartbreaking details of her strained and complex relationship with her only son began to surface with a clarity we had never seen before. Let's dive deep into the controversial topic of Brigitte Bardot and motherhood. She skyrocketed to international superstardom back in the mid-1950s, transforming into a worldwide obsession practically overnight, following her sultry performance in And God Created Woman. That breakout role was the launch pad that secured her spots in other cinematic masterpieces, including the legendary Contempt and the adventurous Viva Maria, which solidified her standing as arguably the most mesmerising and enchanting leading lady the film industry had ever laid eyes on. When she was at the absolute zenith of her powers, Bardot was arguably the most photographed woman on the planet, sparking trends in high fashion, influencing music, and even igniting heated political discourse. However, stripped of the glamour and the symbol of liberty, she projected the real woman harboured a profound unease with anything or anyone that attempted to encroach upon her personal independence. That simmering anxiety bubbled over and became impossible to sweep under the rug the moment the concept of motherhood crashed into her reality. Unlike so many other celebrities who try to rewrite history to make themselves look better, Bardot remained savagely consistent and transparent about her true emotions. She never once pretended that carrying a child unlocked some hidden well of tenderness or triggered a magical transformation within her soul. In fact, during one particularly shocking press conference when grilled about becoming a mom, she coldly stated she would have rather given birth to a puppy, and rest assured she meant every single syllable of that statement. Right from the jump, Bardot was disarmingly, almost brutally honest about where her head was at. She refused to paint the experience as joyful or life-changing in a positive way. Instead, she characterised the entire process as terrifyingly invasive, like an alien takeover of her body. Years down the line, she confessed she was woefully underprepared for the massive weight of raising another human, openly admitting she simply wasn't mature enough herself to be a mother to someone else. These weren't just shocking sound bites dropped decades later to stir up drama. This was the raw, unvarnished truth of her lived experience at the time. The limelight had already robbed her of any semblance of privacy, so the prospect of being emotionally chained to another living being felt absolutely suffocating to the star. While the adoring public eagerly waited for her to settle down into a cosy domestic bliss, she felt like her true self was slowly evaporating into thin air. In her mind, a child was the final nail in the coffin of her freedom. And this internal war she was waging was deeply personal, raw, and completely devoid of a solution. Tragically, this mindset would soon define the existence of a young boy brought into a world that worshipped the ground his mother walked on, yet remained oblivious to the cold reality of who she was once the director yelled, "Cut." When Nicolas Jacques Charrier finally made his entrance into the world on January 11th, 1960, it was supposed to be a monumental shift, a grounding anchor for one of the most flighty and restless spirits in the history of global celebrity. But instead of calming her, it amplified every single one of Bardot's worst nightmares as the entire pregnancy was shrouded in a thick fog of unbearable tension. At the time, she was hitched to actor Jacques Charrier, but their union was already on shaky ground, teetering on the edge of collapse. She had tied the knot partially as a middle finger to the industry establishment and partially in a desperate bid to claw back some control over her chaotic destiny. However, the marriage rapidly morphed into yet another battlefield. Charrier craved traditional structure and domesticity, while Bardot was constantly plotting her great escape. Nicolas was delivered right there in Bardot's Parisian apartment, a choice that perfectly reflected her deep-seated suspicion of hospitals, institutions and authority figures in general. Yet even the sanctuary of her own home couldn't protect her from the media hurricane raging just outside her door. The press, both French and international, treated her labour like a national spectator sport, with hordes of photographers camping out on the sidewalk like vultures waiting for a scoop. Tabloid headlines ran wild with endless speculation. Would motherhood finally tame the wild child? Would the ultimate icon of rebellion finally submit to the traditional role of a housewife? The answer was a resounding no. Almost the instant the baby arrived, Bardot engaged in a severe emotional retreat. She would later confess to feeling completely swamped, detached and filled with a burning resentment, not necessarily toward the innocent infant as a person, but toward the prison sentence he represented in her mind. Her physique, her freedom and her very identity had been fundamentally mutated in ways she had never emotionally signed up for, regardless of the physical reality of the situation. While her psychological struggles were undeniably valid, the way they played out in real life was devastatingly unfair to little Nicholas. This internal resistance bled into her behaviour, as Bardot was clearly battling severe postpartum depression, a condition that was tragically misunderstood and rarely treated back in those days. She bounced back and forth between locking herself away in total isolation and episodes of intense, agonising distress. Those in her inner circle later described her as incredibly distant, brittle and profoundly miserable during the early months of Nicholas's life. She possessed zero maternal instinct in the traditional sense, and quite frankly, she made absolutely no attempt to fake it. Meanwhile, the world watched with bated breath as glossy magazines splashed photos of Bardot cradling her newborn, selling a fantasy of perfect domestic bliss to the masses. Even though the dark reality behind those shutters was a complete nightmare, she played the game, giving interviews about this exciting new chapter. But when the reporters left, she made virtually no effort to actually be there for her son. And the chasm between her polished public persona and the ugly private truth was growing wider by the day. It got even worse. That cold emotional detachment didn't just happen overnight. It practically defined the very air Nicholas breathed from the moment he entered the world. Instead of being welcomed with joy and celebration, his arrival was marked by bitter conflict. Even though he was just a helpless infant, completely unaware of the drama, the bricks for a wall of separation were already being cemented in place. What makes this whole situation so twistedly ironic is that Bardot wasn't incapable of love. She had an immense capacity for devotion. She just couldn't seem to channel any of it toward being a mother. During the exact same years, she was finding it impossible to connect with her own flesh and blood. She was out there pouring an intense, fierce love into animal rights, political causes, and high-minded ideals. You can't say her compassion wasn't genuine, because it was. The problem was that it was highly selective, reserved for creatures that didn't call her Mom. Poor Nicola was left standing on the sidelines, existing totally outside the zone where her heart felt open. By 1962, the marriage between Brigitte and Jacques had crashed and burned, deteriorated to a point where fixing it was a pipe dream. So now you have this kid dealing with a mother who is completely checked out, plus he's forced to witness his parents screaming at each other day in and day out because their visions for the future were on totally different planets. When you have that much toxic energy, a divorce isn't just a possibility, it becomes the only inevitable conclusion. But that split did way more than just end a marriage. It defined every single day of Nicholas's life moving forward, and definitely not for the better. This was the start of a truly heartbreaking childhood saga. When the dust settled and the marriage was officially over, full custody of little Nicolas Jacques Charrier was handed over to his father. You have to understand, back in those days, a ruling like that was legally and culturally earth-shattering. We're talking about an era where mothers were practically guaranteed custody by default. Yet in a shocking twist, Bardot didn't lift a finger to fight for the daily care of her own son. Instead, Nicola was packed off to live mostly with his paternal grandparents, growing up strictly under his father Charrier's watch. To the outside world and the tabloids, this decision was absolutely scandalous, but in Bardot's mind, it was the only solution that made any logical sense. She would later try to justify it by explaining that Nicholas needed stability and roots, things she was brutally honest about admitting she was completely incapable of providing. Look at her life at the time. It was a whirlwind of chaos, emotional instability, and a relentless non-stop public spectacle. She was jet-setting, constantly always surrounded by entourages of strangers, hunted down by aggressive paparazzi and battling deep depression. As she put it herself, she felt totally lost in that crazy celebrity machine. So when she looked in the mirror, she didn't see a mother. She didn't see a safe haven or a grounding presence for a child. But here is the tragedy. What Bardot called brutal honesty, her son felt as cold-hearted abandonment. From that moment on, Nicholas's entire childhood played out miles away from his famous mother. He grew up in a hushed, traditional bubble. A world completely removed from the glitz of film sets and the blinding flashbulbs of cameras. While Bardot was busy being the biggest sex symbol in Europe, her son was living in near total anonymity, growing up without her, tucking him in, without her daily routines and without a shred of her affection. Any contact between the superstar mother and her estranged son was sporadic and unpredictable at best. It's not that Bardot vanished off the face of the earth, but she certainly wasn't the kind of mother he could ever actually rely on for anything real. Sure, she'd pop in for a visit, maybe make a phone call, check the boxes of keeping up with him, but the emotional bond, it was non-existent. As the years rolled by, that emotional distance hardened into concrete. Nicholas grew up seeing the harsh reality that his mother had all the time in the world for her fans and her pets, but zero time for him. If we're being real, this detached arrangement suited Bardot's instincts perfectly. She convinced herself that stepping out of the picture was actually the noble choice, thinking her absence spared Nicholas from the toxic chaos of her fame and her own emotional volatility. The thing is, once that distance becomes your new normal, trying to bridge the gap requires a massive amount of effort. And let's be honest, effort was something Bardot struggled to muster up whenever the subject of motherhood was on the table. For decades, the chasm between Brigitte Bardot and her son was shrouded in silence, leaving the public to fill in the blanks and imagine their own happy endings. Honestly, most people assumed that behind closed doors, things were relatively fine and dandy. That all changed when Bardot dropped her bombshell memoir Initials BB in 1996, shattering the silence in the cruelest, harshest way imaginable. She didn't write about being a mom with regret or gentle words. No, she wrote about it like it was a natural disaster that struck her rather than a life path she had chosen. In sections that instantly became infamous tabloid fodder, Bardot described carrying Nicola not as a joy, but as feeling like a quote-unquote tumour feeding off her body. She didn't stop there. She explicitly referred to her own son as the object of her misfortune. And don't think for a second these were just slip-ups or isolated sentences taken out of context. They were part of a disturbing larger narrative where Bardot framed the entire concept of pregnancy and motherhood as a hostile invasion, emotional, physical, and permanent. Even decades later, she stood her ground, doubling down on the claim that she simply wasn't wired for the role of a mother. Naturally, the memoir caused a massive scandal. But amidst the media frenzy, people missed how deeply personal and painful this was for Nicholas. This was his own mother announcing to the entire world that she never actually wanted him. By the time Initials BB was gearing up for release, Nicolas Jacques Charrier had built a life light years away from Bardot's toxic orbit, and he desperately wanted to keep it that way. According to the reports swirling around at the time, Nicolas and his dad, Jacques Charrier, fought tooth and nail to stop or censor the chapters of the memoir that dragged them through the mud. They weren't trying to rewrite her history. All they wanted was to protect their names and keep their private pain from being splashed across headlines yet again, but their desperate attempts failed miserably. The book hit the shelves with every brutal word intact, and the moment it dropped, the situation exploded into a full-blown legal war. Now let's look at the other side of this mess. It is easy to read Bardot's vicious quotes and conclude the memoir was just an act of cruelty. But lurking in the background, a counterattack was brewing. Jacques Charrier was absolutely not about to let Bardot walk away with the final word. Back in 1997, Jacques Charrier decided he had stayed silent long enough and fired back with a literary bombshell of his own, titled Ma réponse à Brigitte Bardot, or My Response to Brigitte Bardot. The contrast between the two works was stark. While Bardot's memoir was a sprawling philosophical journey through her psyche, Charrier's book was a precise tactical strike intended to correct the record. His objective was crystal clear from page one. He was on a mission to dismantle her version of history, specifically the damaging narrative she painted regarding her motherhood and alleged emotional void. Charrier wasn't trying to claim that parenting was a walk in the park for Bardot, but he vehemently rejected the narrative that she was a heartless zombie who felt absolutely nothing for their child. During the media blitz surrounding his book's launch, Charrier dropped a major revelation claiming that Bardot's private letters painted a completely different picture than her public persona. It was a narrative that clashed violently with the cold, detached figure she had deliberately crafted in her own best-selling autobiography. He revealed that he had held on to old correspondence receipts, essentially that showcased genuine tenderness, deep concern, and undeniable flashes of maternal connection toward little Nicolas. These private moments stood in direct opposition to the icy, indifferent statements she was making to the press and in her book. According to Charrier's perspective, Bardot's love for her son wasn't non-existent. It was simply messy, volatile, and constantly buried under layers of paralysing fear and self-preservation mechanisms. His most explosive argument was the theory that Bardot wasn't actually incapable of love, but rather that she had rewritten her own history to portray herself that way as a coping mechanism to justify her absence. Charrier suggested that the film icon was intentionally exaggerating her emotional distance, using it as a tool to regain a sense of agency over her chaotic life. It was all about control, trying to steer a life that she felt had been hijacked by studio executives, ravenous fans, various lovers, the symbol of Marianne, and societal expectations she never signed up for. In his version of the story, Bardot wasn't the cruel monster she appeared to be. She was a woman on the defensive, building walls to survive. She had transformed herself into a living symbol of refusal and rebellion, even if maintaining that image meant flattening the nuanced, complicated truth of her real feelings. Crucially, Charrier framed his manuscript as a shield for Nicolas, arguing that by casting herself as the tragic victim of motherhood, Bardot had unfairly dumped the emotional baggage onto a son who never asked for the spotlight. Charrier was adamant that regardless of her internal struggles, publishing those specific hurtful words for the world to read was a step too far. The issue wasn't just that the comments were shocking to the public, it was that they were gratuitous and fundamentally unnecessary to her story. When news of Charrier's counterattack reached Bardot, her reaction was shocking in its own right. She didn't explode. She simply refused to engage in a public mud-slinging contest. She didn't bother to dissect his claims or refute them point by point. Instead, she gave the book the cold shoulder, largely pretending it didn't exist. To her, this was just another man from her past trying to seize control of her narrative and dictate who she was supposed to be. In subsequent interviews, she doubled down, insisting she wrote her memoir to purge her own truth, not to coddle the feelings of others, believing that if people felt uncomfortable, that was their problem to process, not hers. So here we were again, two parents shouting two completely contradictory versions of reality, while their son was left standing in the crossfire of their bitter public feud. By this stage in the drama, the bridge was burned and any hope for a peaceful family reconciliation had completely evaporated. The only place left to settle this was a courtroom, but by the time the ink was dry on his mother's scandalous book, Nicolas knew one thing for sure: he wanted zero part of this fame game. As he grew into adulthood, Nicolas made a decisive break from France, eventually putting down roots in Norway, a nation famous for respecting privacy and valuing a quiet, anonymous existence. His lifestyle choice was the polar opposite of the chaotic, flashbulb-filled existence his mother symbolised on the world stage. There in the north, he constructed a deliberately low-key life, getting married, raising his own family and building a career in technology, light years away from the entertainment industry. Unlike so many Nepo babies or children of legends who chase the limelight, Nicholas never once tried to cash in on the scandal or correct the public record. You never saw him giving tearful interviews about his childhood trauma, nor did he ever attempt to publish a counter-memoir to settle the score. He refused to monetize his pain because his ultimate goal was simply to leave the toxicity in the rearview mirror forever. Therefore, the real sting wasn't just the harsh words in his mother's book, but the fact that it dragged him back into the exposure he had spent decades running away from, with reporters suddenly hunting him down for quotes. Close friends and reports from that era describe him as being deeply wounded by the betrayal, yet remarkably stoic and resolute in his reaction. He understood that jumping into the media circus to defend himself would only keep the story alive and prolong the damage. Speaking out would transform his personal tragedy into public entertainment, the very thing he hated. So he chose the only option that gave him real control. He allowed the situation to be handled quietly through strict legal channels to establish a hard boundary, with the lawsuit hitting the Paris courts in the late 1990s. However, this wasn't your typical celebrity spat about defamation or a cash grab. This was a serious case regarding fundamental rights to consent and privacy. Under the strict French legal code, even public figures and their families have a right to keep their deeply personal domestic matters out of the public domain if they haven't consented to the exposure. And that legal shield explicitly extends to their children, protecting them from being used as content for a bestseller. Nicolas and his father, Jacques Charrier, made the legal argument that Initiales BB had violated both moral and legal standards by turning Nicholas's birth and childhood trauma into commercial fodder. The lawsuit zeroed in on specific damaging passages from Brigitte's autobiography, with Nicolas and Jacques suing Bardot for the harm those words caused. Their legal team argued that the memoir wasn't just art, it was a violation of privacy that trampled on the rights of the people mentioned in it. What made this case so significant was that the justice system didn't dismiss it as petty celebrity drama. They treated it as a legitimate infliction of harm. In the end, a Paris court sided with the father and son, ordering Bardot and her publishing house to pay damages to both Jacques and Nicolas for the intrusion into their private lives. One widely circulated report at the time pegged the total penalty at roughly £28,000, with £17,000 going to Charrier and £11,000 awarded to Nicolas. Other media outlets later converted and summarised the settlement as approximately $40,000, a sum that, while not massive for a star, sent a clear message about boundaries. But wait until you hear the real kicker, the part of the verdict that left everyone stunned. It turns out the court actually shut down the request to scrub those controversial passages from future prints of the book. Instead of banning the words entirely, the judge took a different route, simply ordering that specific sections be flagged with a notice. Think of it as a mandatory legal disclaimer admitting that yes, these chapters were considered an invasion of privacy. So technically, while Bardot lost the lawsuit, she didn't face the total defeat or censorship her critics were hoping for. The memoir remained on the shelves, available for anyone to buy. The ink stayed dry on the page. The court recognised the damage caused, but the exposure of those private family secrets was allowed to stand. Naturally, this outcome continued to cast a long shadow over Nicholas's life, and Bardot, true to her fiery reputation, she didn't react by apologising or softening her tone one bit. If anything, the legal drama only seemed to harden her resolve, reinforcing the rebellious identity she had spent a lifetime cultivating in the public eye. She remained the woman who refused to act the part, refused to say sorry just because society demanded it, and absolutely refused to fake an emotion she didn't feel. Legally, she took a hit, but she got to keep her voice. For Nicholas, winning the case felt incredibly empty. It was a hollow victory because in the court of public opinion, the jury was still very much out. You had one camp passionately defending Bardot, claiming her brutal honesty was refreshing, arguing that her refusal to paint a rosy picture of motherhood was exactly what made her a revolutionary icon. To these supporters, the lawsuit wasn't about privacy. It looked more like a desperate attempt to silence a woman's raw, unfiltered truth. However, there was a significant portion of the public that viewed the situation through a much darker, less forgiving lens. Many critics, including prominent French writers and cultural commentators, countered that Bardot had mistaken cruelty for honesty. They argued that speaking your truth isn't a free pass to inflict deep emotional wounds on your own flesh and blood. For the first time in decades, the Teflon image of Bardot as the untouchable screen goddess began to show visible cracks. The court's ruling essentially confirmed what people had whispered for years, that her fierce radical independence came with a very steep, very human price tag. Following the bitter legal battle, the already thin line of communication between mother and son all but evaporated completely. There were no heartwarming reunions, no staged photo ops for the tabloids to coo over, and certainly no attempt to spin a softer narrative. Nicholas simply walked away. He doubled down on his need for solitude, remaining in Norway and shielding his own family from the toxic glare of his mother's fame. And perhaps most tellingly, he never used the lawsuit as a soapbox. He didn't go on talk shows to bash his mother. He maintained a dignified, stony silence. This brings us to Brigitte Bardot's final vow. Interestingly, in the twilight of her life, the star did something that managed to surprise even her most cynical detractors. She ceased all public discussion regarding her motherhood and her son. After years of explosive honesty that led to lawsuits and public scorn, Bardot finally decided to draw a hard line in the sand. And if we go by her own statements, that boundary wasn't a PR move, it was the result of a solemn promise. A specific pledge she made directly to Nicolas Jacques Charrier himself to keep his name out of the press. I promised Nicolas I would never talk about him in my interviews, she stated plainly in a 2024 sit-down with Paris Match. It was a brief, matter-of-fact declaration, almost clinical in its delivery. It was exactly the kind of bluntness you'd expect from her. Yet considering the decades of oversharing that preceded it, the restraint was absolutely monumental. Remember, this was the same woman who had previously taken every chance she got to remind the world that she would rather be anything than a mother. However, don't mistake that silence for a happy ending. For Nicola, the emotional scars ran far too deep for a simple truce to fix. And as for Bardot, she had no sudden desire to embrace the domestic life she had spent 50 years running away from. There is zero evidence to suggest that Bardot and Nicola ever managed to repair their bond in a meaningful, personal way. Nicola had long ago moved on, building a stable life with his Norwegian wife Anne-Line Bjerken, raising 2 daughters and eventually becoming a grandfather on his own terms. In her final years, Bardot did acknowledge being a great-grandmother, but she mentioned it with a sense of detachment, stating facts rather than expressing matriarchal pride. In a separate candid conversation with the magazine Le Point, she didn't sugarcoat the reality, remarking bluntly that her great-grandchildren didn't even speak French and that encounters with them were incredibly rare. There was no weeping over lost time, no nostalgic wish to turn back the clock, just the cold reality. By this point, Bardot had become a complete recluse. Hiding away in her Saint-Tropez estate, her universe had shrunk down to exclude almost all humans, focusing entirely on her animal rights crusade. She'd walked away from the silver screen decades prior and showed absolutely no interest in rewriting her history or making herself more palatable to the public. Even as her health began to fail, necessitating frequent trips to the hospital in Toulon and sparking premature death hoaxes online, she remained guarded and defiant. But regarding Nicola, she kept her promise. When the end finally came in December 2026, Nicholas's reaction was just as controlled and private as the life he had built. He travelled to Saint-Tropez for the funeral, appearing quietly without fanfare or an entourage. He released no statements of grief, gave no interviews, and simply paid his respects before returning to his anonymity. What else was there to do? It was a life lived without apologies. But then again, Bardot's entire existence was a tapestry of turbulent relationships, so this tragic family dynamic wasn't exactly a shock to anyone paying attention. Looking back, she married her first husband, Roger Vadim, in 1952 when she was barely 18 years old. Vadim wasn't just a spouse, he was the architect of her fame. It was his visionary film and God-created woman that took a pretty girl and turned her into an international sex symbol and cultural phenomenon. Their romance was intense, completely blurring the boundaries between their real lives and the art they were creating together. In fact, during the production of that very movie, Bardot fell hard for her co-star Jean-Louis Trintignant, an affair that ultimately destroyed her marriage to Vadim by 1957. Years later, Vadim would discuss their split with shocking candour, admitting he actually admired her wild curiosity and her absolute refusal to ever fully belong to another human being. Next on the list of high-profile conquests was the brooding actor Jean-Louis Trintignant. A romance that burned incredibly bright but ultimately fizzled out in record time. The pair cohabitated for about 2 years, creating a little world together. Yet even while sharing a roof, Brigitte's heart was already restless, drifting toward her next obsession before the current chapter had fully closed. The inevitable crash came when she started stepping out with the crooner Gilbert Bécaud, setting the blueprint for a chaotic cycle of love and leaving that would define her personal life for decades. Brigitte didn't do gentle letdowns or cautious exits. She was a force of nature who followed her impulses blindly, doing exactly what she pleased the moment she pleased with zero regard for the wreckage left behind. Then came husband number 2, Jacques Charrier. And while their union kicked off with fireworks and undeniable chemistry, it quickly devolved into one of the most scandalous public train wrecks in her entire romantic history. Fast forward to 1966, and she was walking down the aisle again, this time with the ultra-wealthy German industrialist and playboy Günther Sachs. To call their dating phase fancy would be an insult. It was opulent, wild, and ridiculously extravagant, shattering even the high benchmarks set by the jet-set elite of the era. In a move that became legend, Sachs literally rained thousands of red roses down onto her property from a helicopter, and swept off her feet, they jetted off to Las Vegas to tie the knot only a few months after their first hello. But grand gestures don't guarantee stability, and the marriage was a volatile cocktail of egos. With both of them jumping into other beds almost immediately, the whole thing imploded by 1969. Looking back, Sachs held no grudges, viewing their time with a blend of awe and exhaustion, famously dropping the line that a single year alongside Brigitte was worth 10 years with any other woman on earth. Even though they never exchanged rings, you can't tell her story without mentioning Serge Gainsbourg. That affair wasn't just a fling. It was a pop culture earthquake, easily becoming one of the most defining and artistic connections she ever experienced. Together they created the steamy track Je t'aime moi non plus, a recording so heavy with breathy suggestion that Brigitte actually panicked and demanded it be locked away in a vault. For a woman who lived her life shocking the bourgeoisie, that hesitation spoke volumes, though when Serge later cut the track with Jane Birkin, it exploded into a massive global hit. But when Brigitte's original cut finally saw the light of day years later, it stood on its own as a masterpiece of raw allure, remaining truly iconic in its own right. What they had was the perfect distillation of the Bardot brand during that era: pure, unadulterated eroticism, fierce rebellion, and total artistic liberation. Her romantic journey finally found a permanent harbour with her last husband, businessman Bernard Dormal. They wed in 1992 and stayed side by side right up until the very end. This union was a stark contrast to the circus of her youth, playing out in the shadows far removed from the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi and the glitz of movie premieres. Dormal hinted later on that their stability gave Brigitte the courage to try and bridge the gap with her estranged son, although those wounds were too deep to ever completely heal. Their life together was a mirror of her later years, representing a deliberate pivot away from the spotlight and deep into a life of seclusion. It wasn't about the fiery passion of the 60s anymore. It was a partnership built on a shared desire to hide from the world, and in many ways it might have been the only authentic connection she ever really had. She once famously confessed, "My dream would be the solitude of two," and honestly, that single sentence probably encapsulates her entire romantic philosophy better than any biography could. She wanted someone there, but she refused to be owned, craving closeness without losing herself, so you can't really call her past breakups failures in the traditional sense. They were simply the actions of a woman who ripped up the script society handed her, choosing to live on her own terms, even when the price tag for that freedom was incredibly high. For a figure who spent a lifetime stirring the pot and sparking outrage, Brigitte Bardot's final exit was surprisingly peaceful and understated. The end came after a long, slow decline, marked by several trips to the hospital in Toulon as her body simply began to give out. There wasn't one dramatic event that took her. The official reports described it as the natural conclusion of old age and a series of lingering health issues finally catching up with her. Almost immediately after the news broke, the floodgates opened and tributes came rushing in from every corner of the globe, from politicians and movie stars to fashion icons and the animal welfare groups she championed. French television networks cleared their schedules, running marathon broadcasts of her classic films to honour the screen legend. The next morning, the papers were plastered with full-page spreads of Brigitte in her prime barefoot on the sands of Saint-Tropez, laughing wildly on set or piercing the lens with that trademark-defiant gaze that made her a star. The French Ministry of Culture didn't mince words, calling her a once-in-a-century presence, a rare cultural comet that burns brighter than anything else in the sky. They acknowledged that she didn't just transform the movie business, she fundamentally shifted the paradigm of how women were viewed in society. Even the organisers at Cannes released a touching statement crediting her with reinventing the concept of the European star as someone raw, natural and completely indifferent to the glossy, manufactured perfection of Hollywood. What was really interesting about the global reaction was that nobody tried to clean up her image or hide her flaws. Instead, they celebrated her absolute lack of fear. Time and again, she was remembered as the woman who said exactly what she was thinking, regardless of how uncomfortable or angry it made the people around her. Her fans and critics alike emphasised that she never played the game. She never tried to be the nice girl, she had no strategy, and she certainly didn't care about being liked by everyone. She didn't change her tune just because the winds of public opinion shifted, and that stubborn authenticity is her true legacy. Brigitte Bardot was a puzzle that refused to be solved. She wasn't built to be a sweet old lady who aged gracefully for the cameras, and she definitely didn't soften her edges as the years went by. But despite all that friction, you cannot deny the mark she left on the world. We have to remember she was patient zero for modern celebrity madness, one of the very first global icons to suffer through the birth of ruthless paparazzi culture. Her privacy wasn't just violated, it was obliterated. Every romance was dissected under a microscope, and her body was treated like it belonged to the public domain rather than to her. The media circus around her pregnancy was less like reporting and more like a military siege, remaining one of the most grotesque examples of press harassment in French history, which eventually helped push through the strict privacy laws the country has today. So when she finally turned her back on the movie industry for good in 1973, it wasn't a gentle retirement or a fading away. It was a hard slam of the door, a total and complete rejection of the life she had led. She chose self-imposed exile, fleeing a machine that had made millions off her face and body, while offering her absolutely zero protection or humanity in return. Instead, she took all that fiery intensity and channeled it into the voiceless transforming into one of Europe's most relentless warriors for animal rights through her foundation, her books, and her tireless activism. She didn't just lend her name to the cause, she positioned herself as the ultimate warrior for the voiceless, waging a crusade against the brutal realities of industrial animal cruelty. For her die-hard fan base, this wasn't a celebrity whim. It was solid proof of her moral backbone, showing the world her convictions were deep-seated and far from just a performance. She stayed dedicated to that mission for decades, but at the exact same time, the words coming out of her mouth started tearing her public image apart. Instead of fading quietly into the background like most aging stars, Bardot doubled down, diving headfirst into the messy world of politics. Her takes on sensitive topics like immigration, faith, feminism and social shifts didn't mellow with age. They got sharper, meaner and sparked global outrage. The French courts didn't let it slide, either handing her multiple convictions for inciting racial hatred, a dark legal record that now sits permanently beside her cinematic legacy. This massive contradiction became the central puzzle the world had to solve when the time came to process her eventual passing. On one side, you had millions grieving the loss of the icon who practically single-handedly tore down the walls of sexual repression. On the other, people struggled to square that liberating image with the inflammatory rhetoric she spouted during her twilight years. It was a rude awakening for Gen Z and younger admirers who were shocked to find out that the ultimate symbol of freedom could also advocate for exclusion. Even France couldn't sweep it under the rug. The obituaries in the biggest papers were brutally honest, putting her dual nature right on the front page. They painted her as a complex figure, simultaneously a trailblazer for female independence and a woman whose political tongue became weaponized over time. Yet even the critics who despised her views had to bow down to the sheer magnitude of her cultural impact. When President Macron called her a legend of the century, he wasn't co-signing her rants but acknowledging the undeniable historical hurricane she represented. Cultural historians have since pointed out that Bardot wasn't some strange glitch in the system. She was actually the perfect example of the double-edged sword of total freedom, a woman who spoke her mind with absolutely zero filter. She refused to get with the times or update her software, rejecting the idea that being a legend meant reinventing yourself to fit modern norms. But here is the truth. Without her initial rebellion, the entire landscape of French pop culture and women's autonomy would look radically different today. Long after she walked away from the movie sets, Brigitte Bardot never stopped moulding the culture around her. Her public image seemed to detach from her actual body, taking on a mythological life that nothing could destroy. Back in 1969, she was chosen as the face of Marianne, the symbol of the French Republic, an insane honour that put a former sex symbol at the very heart of national identity. For decades following that, her specific vibe kept reverberating through the halls of high fashion and the music industry. The messy bedhead, the bare feet, that signature winged eyeliner, it all became the universal code for effortless, rebellious freedom. Even the generations that couldn't stand her politics found themselves copying her aesthetic and that I don't care attitude. In the end, Bardot transformed from a person into an immortal symbol, one that somehow survived every single controversy she ignited. Her life was anything but boring. We want to hear your take. What do you think about the incredibly volatile relationship she had with her son? Sound off in the comments below. Thanks so much for hanging out with us.